Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Iran says no to a ceasefire. Welcome to the Wednesday edition. As Tehran rejects President Trump's 15-point peace proposal, offering now its own conditions to stop the war. As strikes continue from both sides, I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. And Kailey, markets seem to be fairly optimistic about things right now, despite the headlines today.
Yeah, these may be financial markets that aren't quite sure what to believe, as the narrative does seem to change basically every time you go to check the latest, Joe. Yes, the U.S. has put forward this 15-point peace plan. It seems Iran is not at this time looking to accept that. As you say, they're making their own demands, including potentially recognition over its authority over the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah. Effectively, you could argue Iran still wants to be able to keep the global economy, global shipping in somewhat of a chokehold.
Oil prices don't seem terribly bothered by that today. They also want the U.S. to close all bases in the Gulf, which I don't think is going to be happening anytime soon. So nothing has really changed in the trajectory of this war, aside from some back channeling and optimism over talks. But the fact is, oil prices are lower, and it's given stocks a lift.
Yeah, and of course, that is the kind of thing that arguably President Trump would like to see, is the markets not feeling as much pain on the equity side, or, of course, prices at the pump. Perhaps for now, at least, not going to tick any higher today, though we can't guarantee that either. That's going to be up to refining margins and those kind of decisions. But obviously, this is something that the president has to consider, is these market forces and the market's belief about the prosecution of this war continuing.
Yeah. We'll bring you up to date on the very latest from the Middle East here. There's a bit of traffic controlling going on the Strait, which is also giving some folks in the oil markets a bit of a reason to feel optimistic. We'll talk about it with Adam Farrar from Bloomberg Economics, and we'll be spending some time with Congressman Marlin Stutzman to get a Republican member's point of view on this, and also talk about the shutdown of DHS, which may have just gotten longer. There was hopes for a deal yesterday, not so much today, Kailey.
Yeah, deal or no deal, it seems right now no deal is where we are, but that always could change as well. So we'll keep you up to date on that this hour. But of course, we also keep you up to date on financial markets. And for a check on those, we turn to Amy Morris here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
All right. Thank you, Kailey. Semaphore reporting JetBlue is exploring potential merger partners, looking into the viability of selling itself to a rival airline. Shares of JetBlue jumped on the news, now 12% higher. A big drop in U.S. crude exports this week. Shipments fell over 1.6 million barrels a day to just over 3 million barrels daily. That's the lowest level since November 2025. Imports also fell, so it was a slow week for the U.S. oil trade. WTI right now around $90 per barrel. Brent crude topping $101 per barrel. And of course, we check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 up 0.75%. NASDAQ up 1%. The Dow up 0.8%. Russell 2000 index up 1.4%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.32%. The 2-year yield at 3.87%. Gold extending gains after snapping a 9-day losing streak. Traders weighing the likelihood of a ceasefire talk with Iran. Spot gold up 1.8%. Now, the cost of imports into the U.S. jumped in February by the most in nearly 4 years, reflecting a broad pickup in prices even before the war in the Middle East. Labor Department figures show import prices increased 1.3% from the month before, boosted in part by higher prices for petroleum and natural gas. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go to Balance of Power now with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris checking on the markets for us. Thank you so much. Meantime, Joe and I, of course, are tracking the developments when it comes to the war with Iran, which is still continuing on day 26. Israel and the U.S. continuing to strike targets in and around Iran. Iran continuing its retaliatory strikes really all throughout the Gulf, despite the fact that the president is pushing for a deal, says Iran wants the same, that there may be a diplomatic off-ramp that is being pursued here by the U.S. at least, though Iran right now is rejecting the U.S.'s 15-point plan that it initially put forward. And of course, the president still maintains that even as he looks for a deal to end this war, the war itself is already won. This is what he said yesterday.
We've won this. This war has been won. They have no Navy left. They have no Air Force left. They have no anti-aircraft equipment left, no radar left, no leaders left. The leaders are all gone. Nobody knows who to talk to. But we're actually talking to the right people, and they want to make a deal so badly.
That has been challenged by the rhetoric that we've been hearing from Iran, pushing back on the 15-point plan and, in fact, suggesting conditions of its own, including the closure of all American bases in the Gulf, the payment of reparations for missile attacks against Iran, and the lifting of all existing sanctions. It does not sound like we're getting closer to a deal, but that's why we have Adam Farrar to talk to, a true expert here, Bloomberg Economics senior geoeconomics analyst. Adam, it's great to see you back. The last 24 hours have been very confusing for a lot of people. Should the markets be optimistic the way they appear to be feeling today?
So it certainly seems that the markets are moving on the vibes of the president and the president alone, notwithstanding the fact that it is probably unfair to judge exclusively on how the Iranians are responding publicly to these conversations.
Tell us why.
Because the reality is the Iranians have a lot of constituencies they have to handle, and particularly with a hardline leadership that is taking control, they have to be very careful as to how they articulate the next steps in this conflict. On one hand, we're absolutely right, and this narrative we've talked about here at Bloomberg a lot is that the Iranians feel more empowered now than they have at any point during the war. They feel like the pressure is building on the United States, not on them. They're still taking a lot of hits, but that the energy consequences of the Strait of Hormuz remaining closed will hurt the United States and our partners globally more than Iran. That said, they are taking a lot of hits, right? Iran is getting battered by an ongoing air campaign that has not let up, as you said in the intro. And so there are reasons for them to want to bring this to a close on their own timeline. And even though they, over the last 48 hours, we had them saying, we're not talking, we're not even engaging, there are now indications that someone's talking, right? And it does look like there was some element of showing they were talking to the right people with the administration by allowing one vessel through the Strait of Hormuz yesterday. Again, trying to start this conversation. But the proof will be if substantive conversations really move forward in this conversation now about maybe J.D. Vance leading a U.S. delegation to Pakistan, I guess.
Yeah, the president suggesting Vance, Witkoff, Kushner, Rubio, they will all be involved in these conversations if the conversations, ultimately direct ones, even happen. I also wonder, Adam, about the increased buildup in assets we are seeing once again while this diplomatic path apparently is being pursued. This is what happened before the initial strikes. We saw an amassing of forces in the Middle East. The second aircraft carrier strike group was on the way as they were talking in Geneva. Now you have thousands more troops headed to the region as they're supposedly looking at talking or at least pushing for talks. Why would Iran buy that a second time?
So I think there's no doubt that they view it the way you just described. And the reality is that the war has not stopped, as we've said, and that the United States now has the better part of 8,000 plus ground troops that are moving into the region with the announcement of elements of the 82nd Airborne that could be arriving in the coming days and weeks. But the question here that is a little different is that the risks of implementing a ground invasion are so much higher, both militarily and politically for the administration, that it probably is in a different category than what we saw with the buildup of aviation assets and naval assets in the lead up to the initial engagement. That doesn't mean it's off the table, right? I think the president is willing to escalate to theoretically force the Iranians to de-escalate. But the choice there is much more stark than dropping bombs from afar.
Interesting. We've set ourselves up then for, I guess, a pretty important deadline after the closing bell on Friday. Should the market be holding its breath at that point?
Well, certainly not sure if the 5 days or the deadline we really need to be looking at. Within that timeline, we do get theoretically the arrival of that first Marine contingent from Japan. But the remainder of that force, both the 82nd Airborne and the other Marines, won't arrive for a much longer period of time, maybe several weeks. So it's certainly possible the administration could take some sort of limited ground incursion, as we said, in Kharg Island or another part of the Gulf. But in and of itself, I'm not sure the 5 days is make or break. I think more importantly, the president will probably be hoping that it moves away from a conversation of the United States bombing energy infrastructure, which he seems to have decided not to do.
At least for now. Adam Farrar, thank you so much for joining us. Bloomberg Economics senior geoeconomics analyst here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. But we go now to Capitol Hill, where we're joined by Republican Congressman Marlin Stutzman of Indiana's 3rd District. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Congressman. Appreciate you joining us, and I'm sure you heard part of our conversation there with Adam. Despite the president's pursuit of a deal. This war is still ongoing, and that means that we are still spending money in the Middle East, which raises the specter once again of a potential supplemental funding request. I know that that has not yet been received, but considering you sit on the Budget Committee, I'm wondering if it is your expectation, your base case, that it will just be a simple supplemental, or ultimately if this is going to be folded into a wider budget reconciliation process.
Yeah, Kailey, great to be with you, and Joe, thanks for having me. But yeah, great question. As we've been talking here on the Hill, it looks like the number is going to be around that $200 billion number, and there's the ability to offset that. More than likely, it probably is done through a reconciliation package. That's what I'm pushing for. That's what I'm working with colleagues on the Budget Committee to do. That would require only 51 votes in the Senate under a reconciliation process. That way we don't have to worry about what we're seeing right now with DHS not being funded because of the filibuster rule. But this is obviously a critical moment as assessments are being done. Of course, the work that our men and women did through the air and from our ships in the region did a remarkable job. And but knowing now what's happening next with a transition and who is going to transition to does make a big difference to all of us. And so we're really watching and waiting to see how President Trump and his team handle the negotiations going forward.
Mm-hmm. What are you hearing from voters in your state, Congressman? I'm looking at AAA here, $3.98 a gallon nationally. You're above $4 on average in the state of Indiana. How many weeks can people take of this?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously affects people immediately. I mean, we all kind of gauge our economic attitude by the gas pump. My boys are calling me up and saying, Dad, gas is, up because of this. But I think, as I explain to people, and most people understand the threat that Iran has been for 4 decades, that this is hopefully the beginning of the end of their proxies in the Middle East and the disruptions that they cause. Of course, their ability, they have a lot of money. I mean, the oil and gas that comes out of Iran is substantial. This regime has their hands on billions and billions of dollars that they can sustain this for some time. But I think that as I was talking to a friend whose family is still in Iran, she said that many of the people that are there are hesitant to go out in the streets because of what they saw a couple of months ago with the protests, where the IRGC just simply went out and killed anywhere between 30 and 50,000 people. So they're really hopeful that somebody comes in with some sort of ability to defend them and themselves to take out the IRGC and the regime that's there. So there's obviously still a lot of hope on both sides that the IRGC's days are numbered, and that the Ayatollah, of course, the senior Ayatollah is dead, but who's in charge now still remains to be seen.
Well, as your boys call you about gas prices, I also wonder what you're hearing, Congressman, from other constituents, like those that may be in the agricultural sector, as we consider also fertilizer, the wider economic impacts of how high diesel prices specifically are when we think about goods being moved throughout the country. Whose voices on that are the loudest right now?
Yeah, well, agriculture, it has been difficult for several years now, and this does cause, of course, disruption. Most fertilizers would have been pre-purchased, or they would have had those prices locked in. Diesel prices, some may not, depending on their financial situation. But a lot of the larger operations would have a lot of that already placed for pricing. But it does have an effect. There's no doubt about it, and that's why I know President Trump is very aware of that. We have, of course, shared our concerns about a long-term conflict that would cause prices to stay up. But I think that at the same time, and the ag community has been so supportive of President Trump, but this does cause issues, especially coming off of a couple of tough years. So I know that President Trump is aware. He's already is having conversations with China. They're obviously the biggest beneficiary of the oil and gas that comes out of that particular region, along with other countries. His conversations with India are really critically important. And so I think, a month from now, a lot is going to change, as you stated earlier, that the markets seem to be reacting more positively. And I think that's just simply the instability is starting to move out of the market, and some sort of end is hopefully in sight. Obviously, if things change, the markets will go the other direction quickly.
And they will tell us loudly, I'm sure, Congressman. I have to ask you about the Department of Homeland Security. I believe we are now on day 39 of the DHS shutdown, and there was a lot of optimism yesterday about a deal. That seems to have come crashing down with Senate Democrats saying that they just haven't seen the reforms at ICE that they need to see to vote yes. This idea of siphoning off ICE funding is apparently not going to be happening and funding the rest of DHS. We talked to your colleague from Massachusetts, the Democrat, Jake Auchincloss, about the offers that have been on the table. Gave us a sense of how far apart everyone is, Congressman. Here's what he said.
It is totally unacceptable for our TSA agents to be working unpaid, and Democrats are ready to fund TSA today. Number two, the claim from the Senate Majority Leader that somehow ICE is unfunded just is not true. Last year, they put through on a party line vote $75 billion of funding for ICE over 4 years. Finally, the impediment is absolutely not Democrats' willingness to look at this deal. The impediment is that the president said that he's only willing to look at a deal if it's paired with the SAVE Act, which is a voter suppression measure.
I realize that SAVE Act might be moving to reconciliation, but so too might ICE funding, Congressman. Would you support, knowing that ICE is funding the rest of DHS and getting TSA workers paid?
Absolutely. And I think that, there's obviously the debate with the Save America Act in the Senate right now, but that does not have to be paired with funding DHS. The House of Representatives, Republican controlled and led by Speaker Mike Johnson, we send over funding for DHS alone, separate from the Save America Act. So these two could be handled separately. By conflating the conversation, it's what's confusing to people. And so I think that we have to be straight up with the American people that these can be handled separately. And we're already starting to see that the president had some success by using ICE agents out at the airports that helped get those lines through. And my suspicion is that he'll continue to do so. He's just not going to bend on some of the reforms, the so-called reforms that the Democrats want the ICE agents to be held by. And I think that the Democrats, the sooner we get an agreement made on funding DHS, then we can go back and continue to talk about the way ICE is behaving much better and much differently than what it was about 3 months ago. So I would hope that they would realize that the administration made some really critical changes to be sure that we didn't see more problems like we saw up in Minnesota.
And finally, Congressman, as the president, of course, initially wanted the Save America Act included in this push, now there's talk of getting some of those components into future budget reconciliation. I know you're not the Senate parliamentarian, but how do you make that budgetary? What could that actually look like?
Well, with the Save America Act, you have the policy language, but then there would also be funding pieces that would go along with that. And so, I'm hopeful there's some smart attorneys over on the Senate side working for Senate Republicans that would put those pieces together. And that's oftentimes what happens, is that there's maybe enforcement dollars that is assigned to a particular policy. Maybe the policy language isn't clear, but the money would follow those particular actions if the states decided to do so. So I think there's a way to do, at least the funding portion. If the parliamentarian didn't like the policy language, I think we could still get there. But, the Senate, again, moving around the filibuster rule could pass the Save America Act as it stands by itself, as well as the DHS funding. So that's something that Senate leadership needs to realize, that that's how they're going to have to get some of these things done.
Well, interesting. Speaking to us from his perch on the Financial Services and Budget Committees in the House of Representatives, Congressman Marlin Stutzman, Republican from Indiana's 3rd. We thank you for the insights. We'll assemble our panel for their take on all of this. This is Balance of Power, live from Washington on Bloomberg TV and radio.
We do have some breaking news that just crossed the terminal. Both Meta and Google have been found liable in a social media addiction case, which, of course, has been ongoing for several weeks now, Joe. The idea being, of course, that these platforms intentionally addict users to them in order to keep them on, and they have been found liable. I guess the question is now going to become what kind of penalty, civil penalty, these companies may have to pay up for now that this liability has again been found for both Meta and for Google.
Yeah, interesting to see the muted. Well, there's no stock reaction. They're both holding positive. In fact, Meta continues to rise. It's up 1%, almost $6 since we got the headline there. Google, I guess not so much. We're just turning red here, Kailey, but it's down a penny. So investors clearly weren't too concerned about this one.
Well, and investors, frankly, don't seem concerned today by a lot of things, including an ongoing war with Iran, which is now in day 26. No end is in sight, even as the U.S. is trying to make a push toward negotiating, having delivered a 15-point plan, which Iran has rejected, making demands of its own. All the same, equity markets are in the green today, and oil prices are lower.
Yeah, seeing oil prices drop seems to be kind of the underpinning here of seeing interest rates come back a little bit as well, with news that Iran is allowing some, I guess, quote unquote, friendly vessels through, as they've been calling this. They actually have developed some sort of controlling mechanism to get an isolated number of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. That does not include those with Western interests, but just seeing that movement in the global market seems to be making the energy market feel a bit better when you combine that with a 15-point plan, realizing it's been rejected at first, Kailey. I guess they see some path to progress here, and it's what we want to get into with our political panel. Joining us today, Bloomberg Politics contributor and Republican strategist Rick Davis. He's our partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Democratic strategist Arshi Siddiqui, Bellwether Government Affairs. It's great to see you both. Rick, do you share the optimism of the markets here? There's a lot of noise right now, and of course what Iran is saying publicly, as Adam Farrar reminded us, is not likely what is being said to the White House. What should we be focused on?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the number one thing is off-ramp, right? This administration is clearly looking for an off-ramp from the current status of the war. And that means that this could lead to a process, and a process could lead to a ceasefire or even a cessation of hostilities. And that would all be good for the markets, I would think. And even this move by Iran to show some willingness to take the pressure off of oil shipments out of the Gulf of Hormuz, probably mostly benefiting China. But the reality is it's a move in the right direction to loosen up the control, open up the strait, and allow some traffic, means a step in the right direction. And even though there's a lot of confusion out there about who's talking to who, the Pakistanis, the Egyptians, Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, which Iranian official are they talking to, who's still alive today, I think it all portends a change in this war. I would say the wild card is whether or not we see the president and Bibi Netanyahu basically escalate to de-escalate. The president calling up ground troops into the region, that's an escalatory event. Bibi Netanyahu telling his military, we got 2 days, let's destroy everything we can get our hands on. That's escalatory. So right now, you don't see a lull in the war fighting, but you clearly see a strategy developing amongst Israel and the U.S.
Well, on the notion of ground troops, Arshi, what would that optically, the perception around this war, how would that change things ultimately if we suddenly are seeing images of paratroopers or literal boots on the ground on Iranian soil?
The challenge for Democrats is that even though there was clearly no contingency planning, there was no consultation with our allies, no consultation with Congress, is that they are also in the same boat in terms of wanting to maximize outcomes. So, and the stakes just keep on getting higher. I mean, as Rick was talking, I mean, this war has taken on a life of its own. So when you get to the billions of dollars being spent and now American lives at stake, I think this goes on hyperdrive, and the challenge is there a clear off-ramp? And any deal or negotiation, that needs to be based on facts, not on any sort of face-saving exercise.
Rick, a lot of folks have wondered if the president would bring ground troops into theater if he didn't plan to use them. And the idea of seizing Karg Island, for instance, as leverage to open the strait is something that he has apparently been considering, and something he could do as soon as this weekend when that original batch of Marines arrive from Japan. Is that what you see playing out here, the diplomacy backed by a show of military force?
I think that's the key thing, Joe. It's you're only credible in your threats to invade if you have an invasion force. And the president's threats about a bombing campaign in Iran were backed up by a massive armada and shift of weaponry, jets and other things into the region. So if he wanted to use them, they were there. And I'd say the same goes for the boots on the ground. I got to believe it's the last option. It's not a good negotiating strategy. You put boots on the ground, you're going to have body bags coming back. President is highly sensitive to public reaction to this. There's not a lot of public support for this war as it is now. You start seeing body bags come through Dover in a scale that we haven't seen. You're going to see a deterioration of that public support, what's left of it. So it is something I think the president considers. And I think as a negotiating tactic, you're only as good as the bargaining chips you have on the table. And right now, if he wants to claim that he's going to go in and get, Carg Island or secure the uranium, then he's got to have the troops to do it. And I think that, if anything, is an important mobilization strategy.
It's a fair point, and obviously none of us want to see more American casualties. Arshi, if there is a diplomatic off-ramp to avoid that, I also want to talk about the kind of cast of characters that is going to be pursuing it, because it is, yes, the envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner who seem to be involved in any kind of negotiation. We have also the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance, who we understand is one of the more skeptical voices around this, even though he is supporting what the president is pursuing here. Historically, he has been very against the U.S. getting more involved in the Middle East. I wonder what you make of him having now potentially an outsized role in the way that this moves forward, Arshi.
Well, it's particularly interesting because he's been a bit MIA recently, right? I mean, we haven't seen a lot of him since this started, and the president also made some comments about who was his clear successor, which I think suddenly the vice president actually did reappear and reemerge. But it does show the complexity of this debate within the Republican Party in terms of what this means. So I think we'll see, but this is very fluid, as you well know, and it's not clear who's quite negotiating, and there's a lot of different layers to this in terms of who will be out front and who will be, but ultimately it all goes back to Trump.
Mm-hmm. Well, if that's the case, President Trump has a lot more to be messaging here when it comes to the future of this conflict, Rick. Caroline Leavitt decided to add a news briefing. That hasn't started, has it yet, James? We're still waiting for the White House briefing to begin. How important is it for the White House to start taking questions from the media and parsing some of the words that the president has brought? We've heard everything from this operation is winding down to we've already won it to there will be no ceasefire in just the space of a couple of days.
Yeah, it's a little bit head spinning, but it is standard Donald Trump confusion strategy. I don't think it's accidental. I think he throws out a lot of different issues, keeps the press chasing them, and at the same time confuses his enemies in Tehran. So this is a classic Trump move. I don't think anybody in the administration wants to get out there and have to reflect these things, because any given minute he's going to reverse his own messaging around this. So kudos to Caroline Leavitt to being willing to go out and face the press. That being said, it's a pretty tame press corps at this point, in the sense that you can't get ahead of this news cycle. Things are happening so rapidly. This week. You think about it. I mean, the massive bombing campaigns, the movement of troops, the negotiations in foreign countries, with an unknown set of leaders in Iran. It's enough to keep your head spinning. And so the fact that the White House wants to start to frame some of this in the most positive fashion shouldn't surprise anybody.
Well, I guess to Rick's point, with all that noise out there, Arshi, I do wonder, while we are looking at every single headline and tracking developments as they come, for the American electorate, if they just are aware that a war is still ongoing at this point and their prices at the pump or higher, and that is basically the gist of it.
No, I think that juxtaposition is very stark. And when you look at it, Iran has taken over the entire news coverage, and in daily lives, Americans are dealing. And I think that's why we've seen some of these special elections go this way, because you look at the economic challenges, and this administration, their economic policies has have made things worse, not better, whether you look at tariffs, whether you look at now this war and gas prices, whether you look at the subsidies on the Affordable Care Act, those not being, the enhanced subsidies not being extended. So all of these things are working together to make things more challenging for American families, not better.
All right, Arshi, Siddiqui, and Rick Davis, our political panel today. Thank you so much. And as we consider how Americans may be tracking the news when it comes to the war in Iran, of course, frequently they're not going to be tuning into an entire White House press briefing, but they may be getting their news off of social media, where the vast majority of Americans spend a lot of time. And we did have some breaking news in that realm earlier as the red headline crossed the Bloomberg terminal that Meta and Google were both found liable in a social media addiction case. It's a first of its kind lawsuit, essentially aiming to hold them responsible for harm to children who have used their services. We want to get more on this now as we turn to June Grasso, the host of Bloomberg Law. So June, walk us through what exactly the plaintiff was arguing here and what consequence these companies may face now that they've been found liable.
Well, the consequences could be vast because this is just one lawsuit among thousands of lawsuits that aim to hold Meta and Google liable for what's called social media addiction and to the damages to teenagers who they say they were addicted to the social media platform. So this is sort of a test case, the first one to go to trial. And so the result will be devastating for Meta if it's upheld, I think. However, there are appeals coming, and the jury, it's unusual, the jury was out 9 days. And a few days ago, they told the judge that they were deadlocked as far as one defendant. And of course, they don't mention which defendant. The judge knows, but we don't know. And so then the judge said to go back and deliberate. Otherwise, there would have to be another trial for that defendant. And then the jury came back with this decision. So it's sort of surprising. And also, I mean, there was a lot of headwinds against the plaintiff in this case because, she was a teenage girl. And there are so many, think about mental health. There are so many different causes for why you may be depressed. And in the trial, Meta and Google tried to bring out some of the other factors in her series of depressions and some, for example, her relationship with her father. So I find it surprising that the jury was able to put the full blame on Meta in this case and Google for something that's so hard for, any adult who's gone to a psychiatrist knows how hard it is to diagnose what you're suffering from. So, I think it's a surprising verdict.
Really interesting, June. There were more than Meta and Google to start here. TikTok and Snap settled before this trial began over a month ago. To what extent did that affect the outcomes for Meta and Google?
I don't think it really affected the outcomes for Meta and Google, although it just showed what those companies thought of the case. And I just want to bring out that the plaintiff's lawyer here, Mark Lanier, is one of the country's top plaintiffs' lawyers. I mean, he has performed what I would consider some close to miracles in some of these cases. And, he is just dynamic. And his presence in the courtroom, I think, probably aided the jury a lot in their decision. But, they're out 9 days, 40 hours. That's a lot of deliberations. And, it's fascinating to see how they finally came to this decision. It'd be so interesting if we get to talk to them, if some of them come out and decide to talk about how they wrestled through all this testimony and what the effect of Mark Zuckerberg's testimony was. We know that he has said himself he's not good on the stand. So how much did that weigh in? There's so much going on in this case that we have to look back on once we hear what the final numbers are.
Well, and when we consider this case as well, we understand the jurors were told not to take into account the actual content of what the plaintiff was seeing on the platforms due to Section 230, which shields these companies from being responsible for content specifically. So is this more about their algorithms? Like what exactly? I just wonder how narrow this finding actually is, June.
So it's hard to tell because you never know what a jury does in the jury room until they come out and tell you what they did. So you don't know what they actually considered. And there's that old phrase that, you can't unring a bell. So once they hear something, are they really able in their minds they may in the deliberations not talk about it, but are they really able to separate that out, what they've been hearing over weeks and weeks of testimony? So it's hard to know. But I think that, when there's liability, it probably does center a lot on the algorithm and the contentions that it was deliberately made by Facebook in order to addict young people. So, I think a lot of it has to be based on that, and perhaps more than even on the, individual circumstances in this case. So what she was looking at and things like that. It'll be interesting to find out what the jury actually, if we get to talk to them. It may take a little while for them to decide to talk, but how they actually came to this decision.
Yeah. June, there's been a lot of comparing to cases against big tobacco or the opioid makers, and I don't know if this is going to end with a Surgeon General warning on the front of Facebook, but did this case prove that social media is addictive for kids?
I don't know that it proved it. It proved that in this one case with this one jury and this one plaintiff that they found it addictive. But I'm not sure that, you can make a broad generalization from this case, because we've seen, for example, in tobacco cases, in the cases over talc causing cancer, that different juries come out with wildly different decisions. So, I wouldn't base it all on one jury verdict, but what it does do is it gives the plaintiff's lawyers in these cases, a lot of ammunition to try to then settle the cases rather than bringing them to trial. And as I said, this is a bellwether case, so it's the first one to go to trial. And with a win, the plaintiffs have that and their ability to negotiate now with the companies about this. And also you have, I think, the companies, if there is another, when there is another trial, let's say, they know perhaps more about what they did wrong, what they did right, and how to tailor their argument better so that they might do better in a second trial as well. So there's a lot to consider on both sides, and it's just hard to put too much. For me, I don't think I would put as much in this one case. I think you have to do a few more cases to see how it really goes.
Sure. June Grasso, parachuting in on the latest breaking news, the host of Bloomberg Law, and we're going to be looking forward to the next edition here. It's going to be an important one. June, great to see you. Thank you for the analysis. This has been not a stock mover, at least not for the worst that you might think. In fact, we're looking at shares of Alphabet right now holding positive, and shares of Meta, Kailey, up over 1%.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's more due to the fact that the damages in this case seem to be relatively small for companies of this size. The jurors decided Meta must pay at least $2.1 million with an M in damages, and Google must pay at least $900,000. So these are not big numbers.
Maybe they can write those checks. Let's see how the rest of the market's doing. We're going to dig in here, beginning with Amy Morris, who's got her view of the markets live from Washington, D.C. Amy, how are we doing?
Well, everybody's in the green, Joe. Wall Street cutting its forecast for the U.S. economy this year, boosting its projections for inflation and unemployment, nudging up the odds of a recession as the impact of the Iran war starts to come into view. And we check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. WTI at $90 per barrel, Brent crude topping $101 per barrel. But look at the markets now. S&P 500 up 0.8%, NASDAQ up more than 1%, the Dow up 0.8%. The Russell 2000 index up 1.4%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.32%. The 2-year yield at 3.87%. Bitcoin now more than 1% higher, around $70,000. Spot gold, which has seen a run of losses in the past 9 days, now up nearly 2%, around $45.60 per ounce. And a jury, as you were discussing, found both Meta and Google liable for a woman's mental health crisis caused by an addiction to social media platforms. Today's verdict in Los Angeles highlights the financial risk facing companies from thousands of other lawsuits, which claim Instagram and YouTube are intentionally designed to addict young users without regard for their well-being. Meta shares, though, don't seem to mind very much. More than 1% higher. Google shares little changed on the upside. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Back to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Amy, thanks a lot. She'll be back with more on the markets coming up at the top of the hour as we kick off this day's Bloomberg Business Week Daily with the market clearly focused on geopolitics today, and for the better. There does seem to be a string of optimism as we prepare to spend some time with Christine Aquino on that. I just want to mention a couple of headlines that have just crossed from the White House. Caroline Leavitt just stepped up to the podium in the White House briefing room, and we do have a meeting back on the calendar with President Xi. Trump will travel to China May 14th and 15th, according to Caroline Leavitt. And Kailey, it looks like President Xi is going to be coming here. President Trump will be hosting Xi in Washington, D.C. at some point later on this year. We've got another redhead on the terminal.
Yeah, no specifics for that visit yet, but it is striking to see that this has now been scheduled, knowing the reason that it was delayed from the end of this month in the first place was because of the ongoing war in Iran. President Trump said he felt like he needed to be here as that was ongoing. That would signal a certain degree of optimism that the president has that this will be wrapped up in time for this visit mid-May.
You wonder if the market interprets it like this as well, because there's already been a pretty positive vibe going on the street, and we are right near our highs of the session. Christine Aquino is watching all of this with us as Bloomberg's managing editor for Markets Live. If you check out our Markets Live blog, Christine is the force behind it. And it looks like it's getting better all the time here. Christine, I'm just wondering, what is in traders' minds? Is it simply the fact that energy prices are lower, or is there a real optimism that this war is about to end?
Yeah, Joe. I mean, I think a lot of the headlines initially sounded positive, and that's what markets were really trading off of heading into the U.S. session this morning. But of course, we did get a flurry of pushback from Iran, not necessarily indicating that they are open at this point to a ceasefire. And so, yeah, what we're really seeing in markets is a lot of headline-based trading. The underlying optimism for a ceasefire is, of course, still there. We have markets, prediction markets in particular, betting on something happening by the end of this month, potentially at the earliest. But in the absence of kind of clear terms, I think we are stuck in this sort of very much a headline-driven sort of environment, even though at the moment, today anyway, based on the green on the screen, that mood is optimistic, but we'll see how long that lasts.
So a headline-driven environment, Christine, does that mean pay no mind to the fundamentals? How are they looking?
Yeah, well, Kailey, very interesting. I mean, we saw, of course, data earlier today, just a first look at those import prices and export prices for February before the bulk of the energy price increase, right? And that is already indicating an inflationary sort of environment. So very interesting because, you know, we are seeing, of course, an oil shock at the moment, even though some of the energy prices, of course, are receding a little bit. But the underlying fundamentals actually also pointing to an inflationary environment. So we'll see whether that comes to pass and whether markets are in fact kind of waking up to this idea that beyond oil prices, there are very real underlying drivers of inflation at the moment.
All right, Christine Aquino, managing editor of our Markets Live blog. Thank you for joining us from New York. Meantime, here in Washington, the briefing is underway at the White House. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, speaking to reporters now specifically on negotiations with Iran, which she says have been in productive talks for the last 3 days, that Iran wants to talk and that President Trump is willing to listen, that he does not bluff and Iran should not miscalculate. As in her words, Trump will unleash hell if Iran does not accept defeat. We want to get into this now with Mona Yacoubian, director and senior advisor of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mona, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. The White House press secretary also contended just moments ago that the Iranian regime is looking for an exit ramp. And I wonder if you see Iran right now as properly incentivized to deal with President Trump.
I don't think yet. I think Iran senses that it has quite a lot of leverage with its control over the Strait of Hormuz. And I think Iran is going to look to use that leverage and extract as much as it can, even though it has been subject to these very, very significant bombing campaigns. Nonetheless, I think Iran still believes that it is in a position in which it holds some important cards, and it's going to want to play them.
Caroline Leavitt saying just now that we are very close to meeting the objectives of the Iran operation. Mona, there's been some confusion about what those objectives are. And if it's eliminating Iran's nuclear capacity, wouldn't that have to include the seizing of the highly enriched uranium that is still on the loose?
Absolutely. There are several questions around Iran's nuclear capabilities and, in particular, the disposition of that highly enriched uranium. Now, there's some speculation that the latest deployments, the new deployments coming in, a Marine Expeditionary Unit, as well as the 82nd Air Force Brigade, that they could be involved in some effort to take control of that uranium on the ground. But again, that is a highly risky proposition. Hard to know if that's actually what the administration is thinking.
Well, and so when we consider the deployment of more troops this time around, we keep recalling that several weeks ago, when there were, before these strikes were launched on February 28th, there were talks underway between U.S. and Iranian officials and mediators, even as the U.S. was amassing massive military force in theater. Now we're seeing a buildup of troops again, and I wonder how you believe Iran is interpreting that, if that actually makes them less likely to be negotiating with the president, because there may have been an erosion of trust given how this went the first time around.
Absolutely. It's happened twice, actually. And Iran is very well aware
Midnight
of that.
Hammer too. Yeah.
Exactly. And so from Iran's perspective, like as they say, they've been tricked twice and they will not be tricked again. And they've actually noted this buildup in their statements, saying, we are watching, we are seeing your movements, and we will defend our territory at any price. I don't think you can overestimate just how deep this distrust is between the United States and Iran in particular, for example, reportedly refusing to engage with Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner, and instead seemingly having a preference for J.D. Vance. Of course, we don't know if these details are correct, but what we do know is that there is deep, deep distrust that Iran has, and that is an obstacle to any sort of successful negotiation.
We know the troops are on the way, Mona. Marines from 2 separate expeditionary units and members of the 82nd Airborne who will be arriving starting as soon as this Friday and over the next couple of weeks. We talked about what this means with Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss, a combat Marine Corps veteran of Massachusetts. He told us this on the late edition of Balance of Power yesterday. Listen.
What the president is doing right now is he's calling 911. He's sending the 82nd Airborne, and he's sending 2 Marine Expeditionary Units to the Strait of Hormuz. And the reason he's dialing 911 so frantically is because thus far this war has been a strategic failure. We have sacrificed a significant strategic card to Iran, which is now they have sea denial. They have demonstrated to the world that they can selectively allow transit through the Strait of Hormuz through missiles and mines and drones.
Not to be confused with a tactical failure. Mona, if the president's calling 911, are these the forces that can reopen the strait?
I'm not sure these are the forces that can reopen the strait. I mean, my understanding is these forces may be used to, again, either attempt to take control of that highly enriched uranium, assuming we know where it is, possibly seize Harg Island, which is, of course, offshore, or undertake some operations along Iran's coastline. But I think the understanding is reopening the strait is a very complex endeavor. And that's why, as we recall, the president, in fact, was calling at one point on NATO allies to assist, precisely because this is not something that the United States could do on its own.
Well, and of course, while he's called on NATO allies, he actually has said that it's Gulf allies that have been more helpful so far. And I wonder, Mona, how you're thinking about the other Gulf states and what they would like to see here in terms of outcomes. Is I'm sure you saw reporting in recent days that the Saudi Prince Mohammed bin Salman is actually pushing the president to continue these operations to make sure that the Iranian government is fully eradicated, essentially, as it stands now. Can you just walk us through what the other Arab nations are likely to want to see here and push for?
Well, Gulf countries all, because they, of course, they are Iran's direct neighbors. They've borne an enormous cost because of these strikes. They're all looking for an end state that will not allow Iran to again threaten the region. I think the question, though, comes as to how exactly that happens. And while it's maybe correct that they want to ensure that the United States, quote unquote, finishes the job and they don't want to be left holding the bag, they're also, I think, quite wary of being drawn into, for example, offensive operations against Iran, which has at times been speculated in the press. They're in an extraordinarily difficult position, very delicate. And I think at this point, they're quite wary of how this could go down. And in particular, as I said, most focused on how does this conflict end and what does Iran look like at the end of this conflict?
Mm-hmm. We're just hearing from Caroline Levitt again in the briefing room, Mona. She says about the prospect of Iran rejecting this peace proposal from the administration. They have not, she says. They have continued, referring to negotiations. They are productive, as the president said Monday, and they continue to be. She's in fact questioning reporting now about this 15-point plan, cautioning reporters from reporting about speculative points or speculative plans. How should we read into that answer?
Well, again, I think, the history of negotiations between the United States and Iran is one that is very much often deliberated in back channels and so forth. That being said, it is curious about the leaking of those 15 points. Did they just come out of thin air? Hard to believe that would be the case. I think what is clear is there is significant daylight right now between the United States and Iran, with the U.S. looking for maybe a 1-month ceasefire, Iran demanding a full cessation of hostilities, and Iran demanding, per its own press, that they retain sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that's going to be an enormous sticking point, not to mention the longstanding demands that the United States have had of Iran, whether it's its nuclear capabilities, its ballistic missile capabilities, or its support for proxies. And here, too, I think we can expect that Iran is going to push back on those demands. We've already seen indicators of that.
Okay, Mona. She's with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mona Yacoubian, thank you so much for the insights and a conversation that we're not about to stop. In fact, we'll meet you on the late edition of Balance of Power, packed with more news. That starts at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Thanks for being with us on Balance of Power, only on Bloomberg.